Hello and welcome back to the Future of Figure Skating podcast. My name's Anna Keller. I'm the host and here for a special conversation about the anti-doping system and how it is working or not working to support athletes. I'm joined today by Megan Duhamel, the 2018 team gold medalist and individual bronze medalist in pairs from the PyeongChang Olympics. And by Rob Koehler, Director of Global Athlete and formerly executive at WADA, and by Paul Greene, who is the founder of Global Sports Advocacy and a leading lawyer working on sports. And so I'm so excited to have, this panel of three experts with different perspectives here. Obviously, the decision that came down for the court of arbitration in sports about 2 weeks ago, and the finally a decision on what kind of punishment Kamila Valieva will receive and how the Olympic team medals from Beijing will be redistributed has been bringing a lot of attention to the questions around anti-doping and just broadly these questions of what justice and good government looks like in the sports world. And so I think this gives us an opportunity to talk about not just this case, but more broadly how this system is working. So starting off, I would love to know what you think we should have as some of the major takeaways from this recent decision and from this saga of these 2 years in particular.
Happy to give a quick perspective from our standpoint and the athletes that we've talked with that were affected by this decision and the decision that was taken 2 years ago. Overall, I think it exposes a complete failure of the anti-doping system. It exposes the issue on how the sport movement has dealt with the minor, and exposes how the anti-doping system really is not that interested in going after the support personnel or the perpetrators who are actually ones enabling. You don't have athletes very often that have decided that they can't wait to grow up and take drugs and cheat, where there's usually people around them that are helping, enabling, and at times forcing them to dope. So I think this is a case that needs to be reviewed by the anti-doping authorities. I think the whole system needs to be reviewed, but I mean, it started with the fact that Russia was involved again in an anti-doping scandal, the fact that, rightful owners of medals at the Beijing Olympic Games didn't walk away from those games with medals, whether they're going to be upgraded or not, was a complete travesty. The fact that, the sport of figure skating is a judging sport and athletes were in fear of speaking up because of what happened and because they didn't want to affect the future of their teams or their own scores in the future. And then, when Kamila Valieva tested positive, she during the team event or found out during the team event, they put her back on the ice with all this controversy as a 15-year-old. I mean, quite frankly, it's borderline neglect and borderline child abuse, where that athlete should have been removed from the event, should have been sent home, and the medal should have been awarded. And then, of course, the saga goes on where she takes all the burden, 4 years suspension, and we're still not sure who's going to get medals because of the creative counting by the International Skating Union. So I think this is an example of how the system has failed and how it continues to fail, and the lack of urgency to look at reform, more athlete involvement, more athlete engagement, and an equal partner into the system to correct the wrongs that have been happening is a sign of failure. So to me, it's one big colossal failure with a whole bunch of different actors and with very little urgency to reform the system.
I into that with the point about the ISU. I think that our sport has lost so much credibility over the years due to judging scandals and various things. And I think that this is a hit that the sport of figure skating did not need. I think that the ISU has handled this very poorly on their end. And now they provided an answer that was a very inaccurate answer. They chose not to follow their own ruling. They kind of twisted their rules, said that there's rules that aren't in place that they're following, and then have remained silent as people have questioned those decisions. And I think that as a whole, the ISU in the aftermath of all of this has really failed the skaters, but also the sport, because the sport of figure skating has been like treading above water very slowly for the last couple of years. And this could be the sinking point.
First of all, it's an honor to be on this. And Megan, your accomplishments are very inspiring. So the opportunity to be on this with you is really special. And Rob, great to be on with you as well. And Anna, nice to meet you. I think in terms of giving a global view of the anti-doping system and what lessons do we learn from Valieva, you got to go back to the beginning. In the 1990s, before there was a doping system, there was a case called Quigley. And I encourage everyone to read it. It's one of the first cases ever where the Court of Arbitration for Sport dealt with the idea of a strict liability system and how can this be legal under European law, et cetera. And where Quigley came out was, it said it's got to be a two-way street for strict liability. Yes, there can be this unbelievably onerous burden on athletes, but at the same time, the famous language is the rule makers and rule appliers must start by being strict with themselves. And that gets lost always. The burden, the axe always falls on athletes, yet the people in charge, whether it be WADA, the ISU, the IOC, always skate by. They're never held to the same standard. When a lab makes a mistake, they're not held to the same standard. When the wrong decision's made by the IOC, in this case, they're not held to that standard. For whatever reason, athletes who don't have the same voice, obviously, they're not getting the same benefit of the doubt that happens on the other side. So fast forward to the Olympics, and I represented with Howard Jacobs, the Team USA athletes. We brought a case at the CAS ad hoc division saying, look, we don't want gold medals. We just want the silver medals we earned. We want the medal ceremony. We'll be the first athletes in history not to have a medal ceremony who earned their medals. And the IOC was not open to our proposal. In fact, they fought us and they made us go to hearing and they cross-examined the athletes. What did they do? They were 100% blameless. Why would you cross-examine them and make them feel like they did something wrong? I thought it was one of the more bizarre hearings I'd ever been part of. And the panel at CAS just never made any attempt to try to do anything but completely defer to the IOC. So that was very sad and disappointing. And of course, the pictures of all the athletes leaving with the empty boxes are been ever since, and they still haven't gotten their medals. So 2.5 years of that happening. As far as what Rob said, I completely agree that Valieva, as a 15-year-old, was not in a position to probably fully understand what was going on. She doesn't even put her skates on without her coach telling her to do it. So no, she shouldn't be absolved of punishment, but we should point our angst at the right person, which is the coach, the federation, whoever else in Russia is doing this. But there doesn't ever seem to be that interest in reform. There's just, we're trying to punish this person and that's it. And just basically get their scalp, which in this case was Valieva, which I thought 4 years was actually an incredibly harsh sanction in light of what the code says about minors and how they're supposed to be treated differently. I'm not sure the code was followed by either panel in this case, whether it was the first one or the second one. Mm-hmm. But I guess they came to 4 years. I still haven't read the full opinion as to why, that I understand it. I mean, I get what they're saying, that you have the burden to still prove it wasn't intentional and that her story didn't make any sense. But if you look at the code, it says that the sanction really should be 0 to 2 years for a minor. So I don't think that anyone accorded themselves particularly well in the Valieva case. And it's not one that anybody can walk away from feeling great about.
Yeah, I want to get at that question of the strict liability and the burden that's placed on athletes in these processes. I mean, reading through the decision, what is very clear is that the burden of proof that a violation wasn't intentional or that if they did it accidentally, that they had done everything that they could have to avoided it. It's a very strict burden that's put on the athletes in that perspective. When you're looking at that, what I kept thinking was, what would it take under that kind of a construction to hold anyone other than the athlete accountable? Does the athlete themselves have to point the finger at their coaches or their support personnel? Have there been examples where anyone other than the athlete, in a circumstance like this, has actually faced any sanctions?
I mean, you have to look at this unique case. That's the word is Russia. So you don't have freedom of choice, freedom of expression. We've talked to athletes that have left Russia. You're picked, you're chosen, and you do what you're told. I mean, that's clear, whether you're 15 or you're 25 or 30. If you don't do what you're told, you're out of the system. That's a starting point. And I totally agree with what Paul said on strict liability. It's so one-sided, the anti-doping movement. You have athletes like Kamila Valieva, who, yes, when you break a rule, you have to be suspended, but to put all the burden of proof on her. But yet you have state actors like Russia, who undermine the complete anti-doping movement that really hasn't been sanctioned to date. They have been to every Olympics and Paralympics since they were found to have statewide institutionalized doping in 2016 as a result of the 2014 Sochi Olympics. You have actors in World Athletics, the IAAF, Liam Diak, who is taking bribes to cover up doping. What has happened in the anti-doping system? Not much. You have the head of the Weightlifting Federation that was doing the same, the head of biathlon that was doing the same. So we seem to treat the people running sport very differently than we do the most important actors, which are the athletes, and put everything on them. And it's pretty easy too, because a lot of athletes don't have resources, don't have money to defend and support and fight the system. So there's a huge power imbalance. There's a lot of inequality happening. And as a result, athletes are always fighting for survival. And that's just not the anti-doping movement. That's the whole system in general, where there's no level playing field. There's no equal power. And when you have that, the athletes take all the burden in every single area that they face, and always have to prove they're right.
And Paul, maybe you have an answer to this, or like an idea of what is it going to take for Russia to be penalized for what they have done within sports, within anti-doping. It seems like every time they're caught in this big scandal and these big problems, the powers that be kind of put a Band-Aid over it. Or you can still compete at the Olympics as, like, not as Russia, as Russian Olympic athletes, as this, as that. Oh, your athlete's suspended, but your personnel is not. The doctor that's working with Kamila Valieva, or had already been involved in a rowing doping scandal, was moved to figure skating, now involved in a figure skating doping scandal. Now they're working at a different figure skating rink in Russia with a different coach. What is it going to take for change to happen within Russian sport? Or is nothing ever going to change and they need to stay removed forever?
That's a great question. I mean, after the McLaren report and the hundreds of athletes that have been sanctioned as a result, and everything that was proven that Rodchenkov talked about and other whistleblowers, you would have thought that they wouldn't have been allowed to compete in the next several games in any format in 2018, 2021, 2022. But then I think in the Beijing Olympics, there was 400 Russian athletes there. I mean, I don't think they really care if they can't have the anthem or the flag. Like, they're still competing. And everybody was even referring to them as the Russians. I remember our own announcers were calling them the Russians. So they were there. I remember my daughter asking me that question. She was about 14 at the time. She was like, "Daddy, I thought the Russians were banned from the Olympics. How come they keep talking about the Russians?" Why? I guess there's just not a strong enough appetite. For whatever reason, they have a very strong lobby and they have a lot of money with the IOC, and there's just not a strong enough appetite within Lausanne world to just simply say nobody's competing from Russia and that's it.
Yeah, and I think to add that, Paul, like all this scandal has happened, everything that we've seen has been a failure. In any other industry, there'd be a complete pause, there would be a complete review to see what has gone wrong, how things happened, and what needs to be improved. The anti-doping world has been acting the same way for 40 years. Collect urine, maybe in the passport every now and then, but it hasn't evolved into looking at the one thing that's undermining everything, and that's the people. So you have corrupt people that are corrupting the system, and who suffers the most? Athletes. They have the most to win and the most to gain, or most to lose when the system fails. So it's just mind-boggling that people haven't taken a step back and say, we need to review the failures and have an honest discussion how we improve this in the future. And of course, very one-sided opinion, but the athletes are never involved in that discussion. Athletes are checked. Yes, we've engaged the athletes. It's all like-minded athletes. But until there's a 50-50 partnership, I think we're going to be walking down, or to use Paul's analogy, we're going to be skating the same path as we go forward.
And, you know, the Rodchenkov Act in the U.S. actually has now charged some doctors, has gone after some. USADA has attempted, and a lot of the cases I've done with USADA, I've actually worked with them in situations where an athlete has come forward and said, look, I got these drugs from this doctor. I want to get a reduction. It's called substantial assistance. And that actually can provide a very useful pathway to getting the bigger fish. USADA does that. The Rodchenkov Act has charged and now successfully gotten a few convictions against athlete support personnel who are giving drugs illegally. And WADA has just criticized the Rodchenkov Act. I mean, that's been the response, is shouldn't be something that's going on. But yet there's the investigation part of it is definitely the way you're going to get the bad guys. I mean, somebody who's intentionally cheating with a lot of money behind them, they're not going to get caught through testing in almost every circumstance. The people that are getting caught through testing, and I represented over 100 athletes last year alone who in anti-doping cases, almost all of them are in unintentional cases. An athlete didn't apply for a TUE and took a medication that they would have otherwise been allowed to take, but didn't understand that process. An athlete took a contaminated supplement and ended up testing positive at a very, very low level. An athlete didn't understand how to update their whereabouts information properly because they're 20 years old and they're in college. They got thrown into the testing pool. And yes, they're negligent, but they end up getting treated like they shot testosterone into their behind. Those are the cases that I'm seeing: whereabouts, contamination, medication, those sorts of things. It's very rare to catch somebody who's taking steroids, testosterone. And of course it happens, but if you look and follow it, most of the time it's coming from places like Kenya, where athletes are doing very unsophisticated doping and getting caught. But you're not seeing a lot of that stuff happening in European countries. In the United States, it's rare that you're going to catch somebody who does that. And there's not enough resources. And what Rob's saying is 100% right, that the way you're going to catch those people is investigation. That's what he's saying. And there's just not enough of that on there. I mean, Rob, when you were at WADA, was that a focus to try to build that element out?
Well, I mean, I think the focus was there with the independent investigation team, the I&I team that they established. But again, we look at the history, and I think that's what we have to do, is look at history. Almost every major scandal that has come forward through investigation has not been led by anti-doping authorities for the most part, exception maybe Lance Armstrong, but most part it has been the investigative journalism that has exposed it, not the anti-doping authorities. The anti-doping authorities come on after the investigative journalists come forward, and speaking to some people that have been through the system and questioning why they went to an investigative journalist as opposed to the anti-doping authorities. The answer was simple: trust. We trust the investigative journalists. They have codes of conduct they have to live on. They have to keep confidential information confidential. There's no leaks. Otherwise, they breach their code of conduct as a journalist. And they don't have the same level of confidence within the anti-doping system. Again, because I think Paul said it and Megan said it, is it puts all the burden of proof on the athlete when they come forward with information. And they end up being targeted for coming forward. So I think that's part of the problem, is there's lack of trust. And until we get that, we're down the same path as Paul said.
So what does that mean in terms of whistleblowers in the international system? So I think we've seen the examples that why we know so much about state-sponsored doping comes from a few people who are whistleblowers for a variety of reasons. But they take, in the context of Russia and state-sponsored doping, they take enormous risks to do that. And I found it very interesting, again, reading about the case with the Stepanovs, reading about what happened with Rodchenko, that there were cases where there were attempts to share information with WADA for years before anything had ever happened, and that it happened because it was going to journalists. So are things still that way? Or are there any protections if again, not likely in the case of someone like Valieva for a number of reasons, but if she were to say, actually, I don't want to suffer this this restriction, I want to expose the system that didn't give me the choice, what would happen? Is that even possible?
She'd have to leave Russia before she did that.
Yeah, I mean, I've had cases with Russian athletes who've tried to come forward to me before and said, Paul, I want to come forward. I want to tell this story. I want to explain what's happening. And I've set it up several times where I've had Interpol involved, WADA involved, an international federation involved. We're ready to meet and have a very confidential interview in Switzerland. And they'll call me a couple of days before and say, they're going to kill my family. I can't go. And that's a real thing. Like, it's not a joke. I mean, I remember having one of them go into the backyard on a secure Skype line in their parents' house 7 hours from Moscow so they could call me without fear that the call was going to be monitored. And so I just think we don't fully get just how hard it is for somebody in that position to come forward. It's really hard.
I've been very interested. Go ahead.
It's unthinkable for Valieva to do that at her age in the system she's in.
And these young athletes in Russia, they only know what they know, and they're in a way being brainwashed. So although they might travel the world and be exposed to other cultures and other people, they live so tight-knit when they're in Russia, listening to the people around them and trusting the people around them, as does somebody like Valieva's parents. Her parents, or her mother, in this case, would have been listening to the support team and the coaches and the federation around her and thinking that all these decisions being made are the right decisions.
And also, federations sometimes will do stuff without even asking athletes. I've had cases where medical records have been doctored by a federation without the athlete even knowing and submitted on behalf of an athlete. And then the athlete is the one who's holding the thing at the end, who gets screwed and ends up having to get sanctioned. And the federation may get blown out, may not. But the athlete's still going to suffer for the, what happened, the ills of what the federation did to them. It is very challenging. And, look, the WADA system is never going to be able to cure everything. I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, so some of these things are not realistic. It's a very difficult system when you have over 200 countries involved and you have the mores of every country involved to think you can cure everything.
Right. And one of the things that I think this case brought up, and then there's been a related case of the skater Daniel Grassel missing 3 appointments in a row, and is now, I believe, is under investigation in Italy. We know very little about what's going on there, but that was after he had gone to train in Russia with the same coach, with Tutberidze. And so I wonder, with a situation like that, so I have I suppose just a factual, how does the system work question, which is out of competition tests. And does that look different country by country? And how does that system compensate for, in particular, skaters are so often training for long periods outside of their own country. Does that in some ways it seemed more surprising than anything that Valieva would be caught at all. But then if she's having out of competition tests, how did people get away with doping? I think is sort of my uninformed question, but it seems unbelievable that it's possible if out of competition testing is happening.
Anna, with the whereabouts testing, I remember asking other skaters, and in particular Russian skaters, about that, and being like, if I go sleep over at somebody's house, I need to update my whereabouts, where I am that night. And I always had, you need a 1 hour window, like a guaranteed 1 hour window where you're going to be at a certain location. So I always put it at 6 a.m. at my house, because like more often than not, I was sleeping at my house, and at 6 a.m. I'd be there. And if I was going to be somewhere else, I needed to update it. And it was like a really annoying, stressful thing to always be updating my whereabouts, especially when you're touring around the world for months at a time. You're competing in different countries. I don't always know what hotel I'm staying at or the address I'm going to be at. I need to find that out. And although I hated doing it, and any skater I talked to in Canada also hated doing it, we just had to do it. It was just part of what we did as clean athletes. And I remember talking to Russian skaters, and they were like, what's a whereabouts? Like, what are you talking about? You update like where you are, and they had no idea. So then it's like, well, why do I have to follow these rules? I'm competing against you, and you don't have to follow the same rules. And it's like, it might seem like such a small nuisance to update something on a website every day if you're traveling every day. But when the rules don't apply to myself and my competitors, it creates a big question mark on the whole system.
So my second, follow-up question to that then is, how is it possible that each country's system can be so different if everyone's under the same world anti-doping code? This sounds like such a naive question, but how are these athletes allowed to compete if they're not under the same standards of the same system?
Well, the whereabouts has two pools. One would be the International Federation pool. So the ISU would have one pool, but that's the very, very top. I'm sure Megan was in that pool, but you're talking about the top 50, maybe figure skaters in the world would be in that pool. Then the rest of them would be in their national testing pool, whether it be US Anti-Doping Agency, the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport, or the Russian Anti-Doping Agency pool. And the RUSADA pool is in charge of policing itself, just like the USADA pool is in charge of policing itself. And so if they're not going after somebody who doesn't properly update their overnight location or things like that, nobody's going to know. I mean, that's the difference. USADA and CCS are going to follow the system the way it's supposed to be done, and maybe RUSADA's not. So their athletes aren't being told they have to update or being penalized if they don't.
Yeah, and just to go with Megan, to give real evidence, I mean, you have a country that was involved in institutionalized doping in Russia, so it was state-run. And we always point to Russia, but Romania did the exact same thing. The Romanian laboratory was working with the Romanian National Anti-Doping Organization, and they got caught for covering up positive tests. So to live in the facade that everyone's on the equal playing field, I think it is a facade. I think, as I said, human frailties there. Why aren't we looking and evaluating the corruption index in different countries? Anti-doping is not above corruption. And if you have a corruption index of a certain level, should you or could you be allowed to host an anti-doping laboratory? Do you have to have extra oversight from independent bodies coming into the country? I mean, at one point in time in China, there was a law that samples could not be taken out of the country. So everything that was collected in China had to be analyzed in China. So again, going back to, there needs to be a deep, honest discussion. I don't think any athlete or any person would criticize, or if we were a little bit vulnerable and say the system is not working and this is why it's not working. And I don't think anyone would be fired. I think it would be brave people coming forward to say, we need to improve it. It needs to be better. And these are the ways we have to do it. I don't have the answers because no one has done that deep dive, but there are a lot of questions. And I don't think, and Megan, I guess I don't mean to ask a question, but the athletes we have worked with in the past don't have a lot of confidence in the system.
And as an athlete, I didn't have time to think about that. I always saw my journey in sports and my opportunity to be a champion was to outwork anybody else. And you know what? I still outworked the Russians that were taking performance enhancing drugs. I still managed somehow to finish ahead of them. And like knowing what I know now makes me extremely proud. But it's not something like, it's something that was more of an annoyance and a nuisance, like to think about these things, but you can't put too much of your energy into it. Just like in figure skating, you can't put too much of your energy into the potential corrupt judging, because then that will take away from your performance, your moment, your work. So now that I'm a retired athlete, I look at all these things with a different clarity than I allow on myself too as a competitor.
Yeah. And when this question of, so the system isn't working, when things are intractable like this, it's usually because, well, maybe it is working, but not for its stated purpose, but it's working to support something else. And that's what I keep wondering is, why we keep asking these questions. So how can it be that Russia doesn't have more accountability? How can it be that this world anti-doping system is so fractured and it certainly seems to be under-resourced in so many ways? Is it because at the end of the day, people don't really want it to be effective? Is that, at what point do you have to look at the IOC or the broadcasters or, who, if you try to trace back who actually is benefiting from this system, you could say, yes, maybe the doped athletes or the country that's winning those medals is benefiting. But I'm curious if you think that there are people within this sports governance world that are actually happy with how things are going as they are.
I think it will take somebody extremely bold with a high power to be able to make changes. And I think that a lot of people, when I talk to people that are, involved in the ISU at least, or Skate Canada, because that's like the big governing bodies that I have more direct contact with, there's just a lot of fear. After everything was exposed, after the Sochi Olympics, Canada had come second in the team event. Russia had come first. There was a lot of skaters that came out of nowhere with Team Russia, making huge improvements in the months leading up to the Olympics, like substantial 60-point improvements. And I asked our federation, I said, after the systematic doping was exposed, I said, what are you going to do about that? Are we going to fight Russia and fight this system because we deserve that gold medal? And Canada's response to me was, no, we don't want to upset the Russians. That was their response. And I assume that that's the response from a lot of powers that be with the ISU and potentially the IOC, is that there's a lot of fear around working with these Russians. And it's something I actually want to ask you, Rob and Paul, with all of your work directly within anti-doping, which unfortunately ties you a lot to the Russian systematic doping. Do you ever fear a sense of safety for yourself or your family when you're so public about these things or so directly involved with people that are speaking out about this?
There's been a couple of times where I've been involved in cases and I didn't feel 100% safe. It was involved. There's been a couple of situations I was involved in the cases right before the Geneva, in Geneva, right before the PyeongChang Olympics. And I was the only American lawyer involved in those proceedings. Anyway, I was very happy to leave Geneva and go up to the mountains by myself because I felt like there was FSB everywhere, honestly. And I just, you just never know in some of these situations. I represented Daria Klashina, which was a famous case at the time in the 2016 Rio Games. She had actually moved to the United States. She was Russian, but she lived in the US for 3 years, and her agents called me from IMG. They wanted her to have a US lawyer, and they wanted nothing to do with Russia. And basically, she had been declared eligible, and then they kind of got cold feet at the IOC, and well, the athletics declared her ineligible. In the end, she was eligible to compete. But the Russians tried to bring me something at the hotel. My wife was like, "You're not taking that. That thing is definitely bugged. There's no way you're bringing that anywhere. You're not going anywhere near that. You're leaving it at the front desk. You're not taking that stuff." You know, I live a boring life in Maine. I mean, you know, I'm in Portland, so hopefully there's nobody here seeking us out. But you know, you never be too sure. I mean, I know that Rob's more high profile than I am, so maybe he's had more situations where he's felt unsafe. But I mean, I've talked to Richard McLaren before, and he's told me there was a couple of moments where he wasn't sure he was completely safe in the aftermath of that report.
I need you guys to share on such a bigger scale and such more important news than like me, who's just trying to advocate for clean sport for athletes. And I get death threats on social media from Russians. So like, I just imagine like higher powers like you who are working more directly, that you would have some scary calls.
I try to stay off social media. And for me, there's not much point in it. I mean, in terms of like, I'm not going to get anywhere with somebody in a Twitter war. So I don't do that stuff. But look, you know, you got to just do your thing and try to stay as with integrity as much as you can, and hope you're okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I won't speak to myself, but I'll speak to the general point: is retribution is real. It happens everywhere, and that's what. I mean, and it's not just for athletes; it's for people that work in sport. Whether you're the CEO or you're someone inside the organization that's trying to make change, for some reason, sport is not interested in evolving and making change. And you know, you just look at the Stepanovs, who were the first ones to come forward, were put in hiding because of the Fair for the Life. Gregory Chenkov is in hiding under witness protection program because if the Russians can find him, they'll definitely get him and try to kill him. So it exists everywhere, and that's what I think stops progress and stops people from making, as you said, Megan, some brave leader standing up and saying things need to change. And being that agent of change. And I think that's where we really need to take a look. Those that come forward are either have retribution or they become pariahs. So no one wants to associate with them now. So the people that were around you, that were happy to spend time with you, now don't want to even touch you with a 10-foot pole. So that also leads for people to stop and try to change the system. So it's a complex issue, and as I said, I think leadership needs to be found, and honest discussions need to be had on how the system can be improved. Like, it's not 100% broken. Like, there are some success stories and some good things that happen, but we're in it because we believe athletes deserve a fair shake and equal footing with sport. And I think that to us is, if you can get, you know, the model that you see in the U.S. and even in Europe, in Oceania, where you have player representation, a collective bargaining, where athletes don't always have to stick their neck out, where they have representation and people that are going to represent them, and have that equal collective bargaining on the rules that are in anti-doping, the rules that are in sport, compensation, all of the things that you bargain with the people that run sport. To me, that's where you don't need those brave leaders anymore, because you have the most important stakeholder who brings people to these stadiums, to the arenas, to watch and pay and watch on TV. Without the athletes, we have nothing.
Yep.
So why aren't they that 50% partner to make sport safer, help grow the sport, and have more transparency and accountability? And until we get there, I think we're going to have this discussion for the next 20 years. But that, to me, is the breaking point of changing the system. Athletes don't want a broken system. They want a flourishing system that's going to support them. And you support the athletes, they'll support the sport.
I found it so interesting reading through the past decision and seeing what the ISU was bringing forward in their case, because it was stronger than I expected in that they cited evidence of systemic doping, things that Atari had said in the press, things that, prior evidence against the doctor, these things that paint this broader picture, even if they're not direct evidence that you could, point to for proof in this case. And I kept thinking, well, if the ISU can say all of those things and acknowledge all of those things in the court, but they never say or acknowledge any of those things in any other public forum. The Russians are banned not because of any of this, but because of the war in Ukraine. And it's a totally, in some ways, I think it gave people who maybe wanted to see them banned for the doping as well, then they could kind of say, oh, well, okay, phew, at least it's happening for this other horrible reason. But I guess I'm still looking at that and feeling, how can they acknowledge this in one space and then not acknowledge it in another? And then that also leads to this question around the allocation of the medals, which again seems like a solution that pleases no one. And so I want to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. I was interviewed by a Canadian journalist who said, "Is this a conspiracy against Canada?" And I thought, well, there's 2 Canadians on the ISU council. That's more than any other country has. There aren't any Russians in that room.
Yeah.
So how can it still, under all of these circumstances, not produce any change? And again, I just keep coming back to, why is, everyone is looking for somebody else to make a move. Everyone is looking for somebody else to be the one to say these things. And
what I see here, Anna, about that whole situation is that Russia said that they're going to appeal this bronze medal to this, or the CAS, they're going to appeal the court. Canada mentioned that they're going to appeal. All this is going to do is delay what's rightful to the athletes, which is a medal ceremony and Olympic medals. The more that people, that Russia, Canada want to appeal these things, we're just delaying it more and more and more. And that, to me, is the ridicule, and that's the wrong that's happened in this situation. And I think that the American and the Japanese skaters and skating federation wouldn't mind this wait if they had just gotten a silver and a bronze medal to begin with. Yeah.
Justice delayed is justice denied. That's, I think you said it bang on, Megan. And let's not forget that the majority of these athletes life is not easy, right? So you've got to struggle to pay for everything that you want to accomplish. Figure skating is not a cheap sport. And the IOC doesn't compensate for anything they do at the Olympics, and they let you believe that a gold, silver, bronze, or even being at the games will set your life forever to be famous and rich. There's nothing further from the truth. So, the other question, this is a Paul question for maybe the future, maybe not today, Paul, but we had done a little bit of analysis on the cost or the benefits, the potential benefits of winning medals at the games and what athletes can use to benefit from that afterwards. So leverage that, whether it's speaking engagements, sponsorship, and that has been taken away from them.
Mhm.
So is there recourse that these athletes could potentially have for that justice delayed, justice denied, and robbing them the opportunity to not, of course, celebrating, but also capitalizing on those medals?
It'd be the question is, who do you sue? Who do you sue for damages here? I mean, who is ultimately the one responsible let's say you bring an action in a U.S. court, who are you going to bring it against? That's really the problem. There's a carve out in the code that says you can go after somebody else who robbed you of the prize money. And there was a case years ago with World Athletics did a case with a Russian marathoner named Lilia Shobkova, who had won Chicago, was banned for 4 years, and $500,000 in prize money or more. And one of the Americans was behind her, ended up never getting that money, lost out on all those sponsorship opportunities. And it was like, well, what could she do? Who can she sue? And the part about it, they've now changed the code to say that that money would get repaid and she could get distributed some of it. However, the rule says that also the WADA and also the other organizations get reimbursed first for their costs before the athlete would then get the money. And I thought that that clause was just indicative of the mentality that this clean athlete lost out on the money, but yet she's still going to have to be in third in line to get the money back. And interestingly, in that investigation, WADA actually waived Shobakova's duty to repay the prize money because they were trying to get substantial assistance from her and get her to sing, basically. So nobody ever saw that prize money. It just got lost to time. So I'm not sure there's a real great remedy out there, Rob.
Know
And
how
it's
it
also the
works.
federations that are losing out too. I mean, this is the other thing, like looking at often the way that money is distributed from the National Olympic Committee to the federations, and then maybe someday down to the athletes. I think we could see that funding was cut in Canada after this Olympic cycle, across a lot of sports, but figure skating is much less. And would that have been different if there had been a medal? But certainly there are countries that have explicit criteria about that. We saw that with if the German team had placed in 8th, which they would be in 8th if the Russians were disqualified entirely. They're still, this bronze or not isn't going to affect them, but the difference between 8th and 9th is huge in terms of those athletes who have been really struggling to fund themselves since. And so you can see like that, whether that's the right way to fund those athletes in the sport based on medal performances as a reward is another question. But even within that, you see the another way that the loss of a medal or the change of one placement over another could totally change an athlete's career.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And it was about the funding in Canada with the program called On the Podium, which is funded by the Canadian government. And the closer you are to a podium, the more funding you get. So if your sport is winning medals, your sport gets targeted for more money. And millions of dollars was lost after Beijing, after there was no medal in the team event. And, that was an unfortunate loss for the skaters of today that could be getting more funding for their future, for their success, for their journey in the sport.
We're talking about there's clearly this isn't working and it's going to be really hard to change it. But if you did have to think, what would you like to see this system look like? If you got this, to sit down, say you were the president of the IOC right now, and you could say, what should this global sports system look like that is preventing doping? Where would you start? What would you want that to look like?
I'm a realist in the sense that I would hope for just some small changes. The new code's coming into effect in 2026, and I think that you could have a marked difference in people's lives if you just made 2 changes. One would be a lot more thresholds for substances that are contaminants that athletes take unknowingly, whether it's through a medicine, prescription medicine, whatever. And you get cases where athletes can't figure out where something came from. It's at 50 picograms, which is a trillionth of a gram, and never provided them any benefit. But the way the system works, they're getting a 4-year ban. WADA's put some thresholds in place. I think more are needed. So I think that would be one change I would look to. Another one is whereabouts cases, which I think it's unfair to give somebody 12 months in those cases as a minimum sanction. So I would think that you would go to 0 to 24. And those could be meaningful changes. They did that with IVs. IVs were banned, and it was a minimum 12-month sanction. Ryan Lochte infamously declared his own anti-doping rule violation on social media and then ended up getting a 14-month ban. They've now changed that rule that it's 0 to 24, and I think that's been a good change. So, I'm not one of those people that says the whole system needs to be blown up, because what do you replace it with? I mean, Churchill said democracy is the worst system in the world until you compare it to every other system. So I think we've got to try to work within the system as it exists to try to make small improvements. I try to save the world one case at a time, one athlete at a time. So.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it was Rob that said something about this, and this is one of the main things that I always find myself referring back to, is that this sport in general needs to be about the athlete, for the athlete, about the athlete, because without the athlete, there is no sport. Without the athlete, there is no figure skating performance. And I think finding a way to support athletes with the right people, with the right sport team, with the right coaching team, and having some sort of system in place that is watching this, especially in a sport like figure skating that has a lot of younger athletes, much like gymnastics and some of the other sports.
And argue with that. And, the simple answer is collective bargaining. Equal partners, 50-50. It's unthinkable that, people talk about the money. It's not the number one, but the IOC brings in $1.7 billion a year of that. We did a study of that. Less than 4% goes to athletes through their federations, through scholarships, and then going directly to athletes is 0.5%. And that's even questionable because of the way they do their books. But the bigger picture is equal partner, more transparency, rules are shaped with the athletes, not to the athletes. And I guarantee you, if they ever adopt this, because the Olympic model is not working right now, and if they ever adopt it, I could see the Olympic model and the Paralympic model flourishing with athletes' involvement. The athlete's going to say, if we don't have the money, we don't have the ability, we're an equal partner with you, let's do it together. If I ever go to battle with anyone, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of athletes, I would take an athlete to battle with me over a sport administrator any day, because they have gone through so much diversity, so much hard work, and so focused to a goal that that's the people I want on my team. So I think collective bargaining is the way to go.
Love to see, and this is something, again, I've had both Rob and Megan on the podcast earlier, and this is a theme that I think keeps coming up in so many of the conversations that I have, is that all of the ways that the institutions work against athletes having a voice. But there are a lot of people who are speaking up in different ways, and being willing to do that publicly and to be connected to each other. I always think, well, you put all of these, recently retired figure skaters together. How many Instagram followers, does everyone have? The kind of the huge amount of fuss, and then with that fuss, leverage that comes with that is real power that often that athletes are sort of trained not to use.
But I would argue that, again, we go back to why is it, this is where we talk about forced change. Why do we always go to the athletes to force the change? Why do they always have to speak up? Mm-hmm. So that's where we talk about representation. So if they had representations that represented them, they can continue to focus what their most important focus is on, their sport. They can do whatever they want in terms of social and racial justice issues. But when it comes to fighting sport, it should be representation that listens to them, gets their collective views, and doesn't have to put them always in the front, always in the media. And then everyone, we talk about retribution, selection, small things behind the scenes of not giving access. So that's where, why do we always have to rely on the athletes to change the system? Sport leaders need to do it, but that can happen through collective bargaining.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I very much appreciate you all sharing your different expertise on this topic, and I am confident that this is not the end of this conversation in figure skating. I mean, we know it's not the end of even this case, but definitely not the end of the calls for change.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Thanks again to Megan Duhamel, Rob Koehler, and Paul Greene. You can follow Megan on Twitter at MHJD_85 and on Instagram at Megan Duhamel. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Koehler2 and Global Athlete at Global Athlete and globalathlete.org. Paul Greene is at Greene Sports Law on Twitter, and his website, globalsportsadvocates.com, also has more information about his work. You can reach me with comments or suggestions for topics or people I should talk to by email at fsfuturepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram and Twitter at FutureFSPodcast. If you appreciate the podcast, you can also support my work with the tip jar at futureofigureskating.pinecast.co. Remember to subscribe and review The Future of Figure Skating on whatever platform you use. Follow us on YouTube and share it with your friends.